Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
News and stories from the sex industry.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Welcome back to another episode of the Peep Show podcast. This week we focus on the Woodhull Sexual Freedom Summit and the Woodhull versus the United States of America lawsuit challenging FOSTA SESTA. We interview President and CEO of the Woodhull Sexual Freedom Foundation, Ricci, Levi, then Larry Walters, one of the attorneys representing Woodhull in the FOSTA SESTA case.
This episode of the Peep Show podcast is sponsored by Quick and Dirty Media.
Are you an independent content creator, webcam model, or clip maker? Quick and Dirty Media can help you with your video editing and production needs at a reasonable price, allowing you to devote more time to creating your content. As a special offer for Peep Show podcast listeners, the first 5 content creators who submit a video for editing will receive their first order free. Make sure to use the promo code PeepShowPod. Find Quick and Dirty Media on Twitter at QuickDirtyMedia or send an email to info@quickanddirtymedia.com. Quick and Dirty Media is proud to be an adult-friendly business.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Peep Show podcast.
Welcome.
Today we have for you a special episode on the Woodhull Sexual Freedom Summit, as well as Woodhull's lawsuit against the United States of America challenging the FOSTA SESTA bill that was passed last April.
Yeah, April of 18.
April of 2018. So 15, 16 months ago now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in this episode, we're going to bring you 2 interviews. One is with the president and CEO of Woodhull, the foundation. And it was really interesting to talk to her about the history of Woodhull and how it started and some of the things that Woodhull's been involved in and its mission. And particularly for us coming out of a sex work community, we are interested in Woodhull's commitment to sex worker rights as human rights issues. So we got to talk a lot about that. And then we also got to talk to one of the lead attorneys on the Woodhull versus the United States, the FOSTA SESTA case, the only challenge to FOSTA SESTA that has been put forward so far.
Yeah, and that's a pretty big deal for us because this is the topic we've really been covering on the podcast since the beginning.
So much.
Yeah, and I mean, we've had a number of episodes on it. Most recently, we brought you a recording of a panel we put on at the Theorizing the Web conference in New York last April.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, we've done other things too. We've talked to a lot of the people who've been working on FOSTA SESTA and the implications of FOSTA SESTA. As people who work in the sex industry, we are so aware of FOSTA SESTA, and all of us have felt its kind of the chilling effect of it on our lives and on our jobs. But as somebody who doesn't have, I don't have a law degree, so it was really interesting to me to hear what the court process is like, how you can make a challenge against a law like this, what the process is, where they think it's going to go from here. I mean, that's stuff that I don't fully understand, or I didn't, and now I have a much clearer understanding of all of that. So those interviews were really, really illuminating to me.
Yeah, and also I think the ripple effects of FOSTA SESTA. So, I mean, obviously it's a law that targets sex workers, targets the quote-unquote promotion and facilitation of prostitution, but also just all of the other people who are affected by the law, the LGBTQ community, sex educators, organizations whose mission has to do with sexual expression.
Yeah, I mean, organizations like Woodhull.
Right. And I think it's actually really important, and we get to this, but I think it's really important to talk about the broad array of groups that are affected by this law and what solidarity between all of these different groups might look like. Yeah.
So this episode is going to focus specifically on Woodhull as an organization and then this particular challenge of FOSTA SESTA.
But I suppose we should also take a moment to talk about the summit itself. We were there. We got passes.
Mm-hmm.
That was exciting.
We also had our kids in tow. So another thing that was really great about the summit is that they provided childcare. This was the first year that they did that, but it was amazing for us. I think we were the family that took them up on it the most, but it certainly made it possible for us to create these episodes for you all.
Absolutely. And having it sets a precedent for the future that, people can bring their kids. But also, not only did they have childcare, they had an entire panel on being a family with sex working parents.
Yeah, I'm so excited. We interviewed the parents that were on that panel, and we're going to bring that to you in a future episode, in the next episode, or maybe the one after that. But we went to that panel, and there's not a lot of places where you hear discussions about being a sex working parent. And there's lots of reasons for that, obviously. But when there's a space and parents who also work in the sex trades get to talk about how they negotiate those things, it was really amazing for us in particular, but I think for other people who were in there as well.
Yeah, totally. And another thing is that Woodhull partnered with SWAP National, the Sex Workers Outreach Project, and they had a workshop that happened like the day before Woodhull, which meant there was like this whole diverse range of sex workers hanging out at the event. And I believe a handful of people were also brought in on some sort of scholarship through SWAP. So that meant a number of people really got to travel across the country to come both to that workshop and then to Woodhull more broadly, which was great for us because we got to talk to a whole range of sex workers who were in attendance at the event.
Yeah, and when you say a range, I mean, they're also coming from different sectors of the industry. So in another episode that's coming in the future, we're going to feature somebody who works in porn and somebody who works as a dominatrix and also somebody who has worked in the brothels. And so I think just being able to, as sex workers, have a space to get together to talk about the work that we do and the activism work we do, but also just the nuts and bolts work that we do is really great. And it gave us, I don't know, it was really great. It's good community building.
Yeah. And I should also say something that was fun for us is that Jessica Drake and Nina Hartley had a panel at the beginning of the event about, I don't know, just kind of talking about life in the industry.
I know. I always fangirl so hard over Nina Hartley every time I see her.
I know. And she was there the whole time, like participating in other panels and stuff. It was really fun. So was Carol Lee, who coined the term sex work. She got an award at the summit this year.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was so great to have these really, really influential people throughout sex work history there, people who've kind of paved the way for the rest of us. So yeah, that was really neat.
And I suppose we might as well also put in a plug for the episode we just did on senior sexuality that we recorded there with Joan Price.
I know. That was amazing.
So if you haven't heard that yet, go backwards and check episode 47 because we recorded that at Woodhull.
Yeah, so we have a lot of content, obviously. So this week we are going to focus on FOSTA SESTA and the Woodhull Sexual Freedom Foundation. So I think that we should just move right on to that.
Yeah. Sounds good. Thanks for joining us today. Jesse and I are dedicated to platforming sex worker voices and covering important political issues for those in the sex trades. But we can't do it without your help.
If you believe in our mission, find us at patreon.com/peepshowpodcast and show us some love.
We're also seeking advertisers to help us grow. Thanks for helping us make Peep Show happen.
Ricci Levi has been engaged in sexual freedom activism for several decades. After a successful career in corporate America, she helped to found the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, an organization whose mission is to affirm sexual freedom as a fundamental human right. As the executive director, then president and CEO of both the foundation and the federation, she has been instrumental in Woodhull's growing leadership in the sexual freedom movement, including recognition by proclamation in Washington, D.C. as the nation's leading sexual freedom and human rights organization. Thanks so much for joining us today, Ricci.
Thank you so much for having me here.
We were at Woodhull, and there was so many amazing things that were going on.
Thank you. Isn't that summit amazing? A Sexual Freedom Summit in the United States right now, today, when there's such a war on sex and sexual expression and human rights and civil rights. And there you were for 4 days celebrating sexual freedom as a fundamental human right.
To be able to come together with people who are actively resisting the sort of sexual repression that we're experiencing right now was so inspiring.
And smiling while they do it.
We pride ourselves on that kind of energy. Thank you so much for noticing it. This is a year-long project. We've already started working on 2020.
Wow.
It's enormous because we're so careful about what we do. This came about at a strategic planning weekend when our board co-chair, Hardy Haberman, who at the time was on the advisory council, said, Victoria Woodhull's birthday is on September 23rd. Why don't we do a birthday celebration?
Why don't you tell the audience who Victoria Woodhull was?
Victoria Woodhull was a person way, way, way ahead of her time. She lived in the 18 into the 1900s. She was the first woman to hold a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. She is the first female to run for president of the United States, and this was before women had the vote.
Oh, wow.
And she had Frederick Douglass as her running mate.
I had no idea.
Wow.
See that? See, that she was something. She advocated for so many of the things we just take for granted today. Like if you think of a work day, not yours and not mine, but a regular work day, it's 8 hours, right?
Right.
That's what she advocated for. That's what Victoria Woodhull pushed for, an 8-hour workday. When it came to women getting the vote, she undarlinged herself from the women's movement at the time because she wouldn't support just the right to vote.
Wow.
Oh, interesting.
She said if we don't have full equality, the right to vote will mean nothing.
Mm-hmm.
She also advocated for freedom of sexual expression. One of her quotes has to do with choosing her own lovers
Wow.
and having as many and as often as she wishes. So that is Victoria Woodhull in a nutshell. There's so much more. We could do a whole podcast on Victoria Woodhull. She was amazing. She said something about those who speak out against her in public are those who practice what she advocates for in private.
Wow. Yeah. Which seems true. I mean, everyone who works in the sex industry knows that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yes. I had a friend who really loved to use porn to masturbate.
Right.
She was not in favor of freedom of speech around porn. She thought the most extreme porn should be censored.
Mm-hmm.
And, we had a heated debate.
Yeah.
And I finally played the only card left, and I said, you masturbate to that. And she said, I know, but I don't like that about myself. And if I can't get it, I won't do it.
Wow.
Well, at least she was honest.
I can't control myself, so I need to control everybody else around me.
Yes.
Yeah.
And remove my temptation.
Right. And my responsibility. I want to make it everybody else's responsibility.
Exactly. It's like I'm on a diet, so please don't bring any food in.
Right.
It's like the inverse of the personal's political. It's like the political's personal.
Yes.
Yeah.
In this climate, I think that's very accurate. Very, very accurate. So that's who Victoria Woodhull is. And that's who we're named after.
Mm-hmm.
And so it made sense to celebrate her birthday. And we called it Sexual Freedom Day.
Okay.
September 23rd. Washington, D.C. made it official by proclamation in 2010.
Wow.
September 23rd is officially Sexual Freedom Day. We have some cool events planned for this year for the week of Sexual Freedom Day.
Okay.
We eventually had to move to August for the most mundane reason you could imagine.
What's that?
Money. Money. Money.
Yeah.
We to get rooms in Washington around September 23rd meant we were competing with one of the congressional caucuses.
Oh.
And because we work very hard to make the conference as affordable as we can for as many people as we can, somebody said, why don't you try August?
Mm-hmm.
And so far, we've been able to keep our rates low and still be in really lovely spaces like the one that you were in last week.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really nice. So the conference started 10 years ago, like in conjunction with this day.
Correct.
And how has it changed over the last 10 years?
Oh, my gosh. Well, the very first Sexual Freedom Day celebration was a plenary and one or two panels. It was essentially a half day.
Mm-hmm.
We did it at the National Press Club, which almost tanked our little organization. It's a very expensive place.
Okay.
But it was so well received that we added a couple of programs.
Okay.
A couple of workshops. We expanded it a little bit. We moved to a different location. And it seemed like there was such a hunger for more and for more opportunities to connect and for people to collaborate. And let's talk about sex workers.
Mm-hmm.
So sex worker issues are addressed in a variety of ways, in a variety of spaces.
Right.
But how many spaces are like the summit, where the issues that impact sex workers are opened to people who never considered a certain perspective or a certain opportunity to include sex worker rights?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important because, I mean, we come out of a sex work context, but we also have worked with a lot of people who are adjacent. There's always been a tension with conferences that are more geared towards sex educators that keep sex workers out of the spaces, so to have these spaces that are open to sex workers and who want to highlight the voices of sex workers is actually fairly difficult.
Right. And that solidarity is increasingly important in a political climate where laws like FOSTA SESTA are putting us all in the same boat and affecting us all in different ways. And so I think there's a real powerful political need to build solidarity among all these adjacent communities and to organize to resist those sorts of laws and regulations.
Right.
I could not agree more. In advocacy or in activism, there's a saying, put a face on it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It's very easy to say what those people do is illegal,
right.
And what happens, happens. Or, I don't know why that person has to dress that way. It's easy in the abstract.
Yeah, I was going to say it's easy to write off groups of people when you don't imagine that any of those people are the people that you love or that are in your life or that you can relate to in any way.
Right. So who thinks of a sex worker as a parent,
right?
For example?
Mm-hmm.
Who thinks of a sex worker as a teacher,
right,
trying to make ends meet to feed a family or care for a parent? We have always had programs and workshops that focused on sex work, and we have always worked with the sex worker community. In fact, can I digress just a little bit to go to Geneva? Let's go to Geneva. In 2010, the United States, for the very first time, was going to be reviewed. It's called the Universal Periodic Review. They were going to be reviewed for their human rights positions, work, and violations in the United States. It was the first time.
Interesting.
At that time, R.J. Thompson, who you would have met at the closing plenary, was our director of our human rights program. We went to Geneva with the U.S. Human Rights Network and with several advocates and activists and organizations for sex workers. Now, here's how this works. a recommendation is made. The standing committee says, okay, this is a good recommendation, we'll present it. Then the country has to accept that recommendation and agree to be held accountable for it. Recommendation 86 said that violence against sex workers is a human rights violation.
Yeah.
The United States accepted accountability for that. Pretty stellar.
Yeah.
So, I wish we were talking about that more.
Yeah.
Well, you may have to do another podcast.
Yeah. I actually want to go back a little bit to what you were saying in regards to incorporating sex workers and sex worker rights. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about any resistance that you had toward that, because in a lot of sexually progressive circles, there's also still backlash against including sex workers or if they do, they only want to talk about sex workers in regards to victimization.
Yeah, or sex trafficking.
So
Right.
What's that been like to try to incorporate and include sex workers and sex worker agency and sex worker rights within the organization?
It has been a vital determination of ours, a central determination to include that. And to any pushback we've received, the answer that I give is that we're a human rights organization. We are a human rights organization. So unless you're saying that sex workers are not human beings,
right,
then those issues will be part of the summit, just like every other issue.
So can you tell us a little bit more about how you integrated sex workers into the summit this year?
We have always had a goal to have as diverse a population attend as possible. And diversity is more than just ethnicity. It's more than just skin color. Diversity is economic diversity, housing diversity. It's issues. It's reproductive justice. It's immigration. It's sex worker rights. This year, we partnered with SWAP, Sex Work Outreach Project, with the national chapter.
Can you tell us a little bit more about partnering with SWAP for this summit?
This year, particularly in light of SESTA FOSTA and the lack of resources and meeting spaces for sex workers to protect themselves and hopefully to save lives, we considered which organization we could reach out to. It was particularly important this year because Desiree Alliance, which traditionally has been an all-sex worker-led conference.
Right.
Desiree Alliance canceled last year because they were fearful of SESTA FOSTA.
Yeah, that was devastating.
It was.
From what I understood, they were afraid that because the language of the FOSTA SESTA bill says that you can be held criminally liable for promoting or facilitating prostitution, they were concerned that their harm reduction efforts at that conference and all of the organizing online in association with that could have been considered criminal under like the very vague phrasing of that law.
And that law is vague.
Yeah.
And deadly. It's deadly. But yes, when they canceled, that was devastating to a lot of people. And so for us, it was an opportunity to say, we have space. We are willing. We would love to partner with you. And to bring in sex workers to a space that's as safe as we can make it.
Right.
SWAP responded strongly in the affirmative.
Did you have similar concerns as Desiree?
In terms of being targeted by FOSTA SESTA?
We are the lead litigant on Woodhull Freedom Foundation versus the United States of America. And every time I say that, I get chills and a stomach ache at the same time.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a big deal.
That is challenging the constitutionality of this law.
Right.
When we went for our first hearing, the government said, Woodhull wasn't our target. We would never go after Woodhull. So I said, okay, good. I'm not afraid now.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
it's nice to be able to then have that space and not feel threatened by that, and use that to the advantage of sex workers to open up a space then for sex workers who are threatened in other spaces.
Again, we're a human rights organization.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't a sex worker rights conference.
Right.
It's a human rights conference. It makes a difference in the way I think people come to the table.
Yeah.
And I think it matters. I think it's still vitally important, and I hope Desiree decides to do a conference, to have a space where sex workers can be just with sex workers.
Right.
But I think it's at least equally important that sex workers have a space to talk to other people outside of the industry,
right,
to make their case, to talk about how we can talk about issues when we're talking to the people who hold the power.
Right.
When we just talk to ourselves, really we're just talking to ourselves. We congratulate ourselves on how terrible things are. We affirm each other's misery.
Mm-hmm.
But until we can all work together to talk to the people who hold the power.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so true. So when FOSTA SESTA, just as kind of a side note, when FOSTA SESTA was signed into law, we went to a tech conference right after that and assumed that because coming out of sex work communities, people were talking about this so much. It was the biggest
It's basically
story.
all anyone was talking about when the law passed,
yeah.
right?
And then we thought, in tech circles, because this is such a huge, internet regulation law, that people would also be talking about it, and nobody knew what it was or had even heard about it. And it kind of drove home this point that you can't have people in echo chambers just talking to themselves and expect that to be very efficacious.
People still are not familiar with SESTA FOSTA, and even when they're told what it is, I don't think they grasp the import, that this is literally the camel's nose under the tent.
Right.
If this stands, there will be no end to what can be censored or who can be punished for publishing anything.
Right.
This is a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's the end of not only sexual freedom on the internet, but really freedom from censorship more broadly on the internet, I think.
Exactly. And, if you look at censorship, I heard someone say once that the First Amendment never has to be invoked for speech we all approve of.
What do you hope to see in the future?
Well, 2020 is probably the most important election in any of our lives. It isn't just the election, because win or lose, we have a mess here.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
We want to do some work on voter engagement, encouraging people to go to the polls.
Mm-hmm.
But we also want to be talking and bringing to the summit the what ifs.
Mm-hmm.
What if he wins? What if he loses?
Yeah.
And what do we do?
Yeah, that seems so important.
It could be a very different conference. As far as content, it could be more focused.
Right.
It'll still be with a human rights foundation because that's who we are. But I think some exciting things are going to be going on this year. And, I would love to be invited back in a couple of months to talk about it. I am shameless.
No, that sounds great. Where can people find information about the Woodhull Summit and you?
Everything is on Woodhull, WOODHULL foundation.org. That's all one word.
Okay.
And everything about me is there.
Thank you so much for all of the work that you've been doing with Woodhull, but also with the summit and
for talking to us about it.
Yeah, and for talking to us about it, and for providing childcare at the summit so we could be there.
Yes, thank you so much.
I guess a selfish note, that was amazing for us as parents of a toddler who also like to be engaged outside of our house.
Okay, I'm glad, and you'll take advantage of it next year.
Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
now is a good time to hit the pause button and head over to our Patreon at patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Even $1 a month shows us that you care and want to see Peep Show continue to thrive. Also, you can help increase our reach with a review on iTunes. Lawrence G. Walters heads up Walter Law Group and serves as general counsel to Woodhull Freedom Foundation. He has advocated for sexual freedom and First Amendment rights since launching his practice in the late 80s. His firm has represented adult website operators, protesters, adult dance clubs, nonprofit groups, advertising networks, and adult producers throughout the world. He has extensive litigation practice in the field of constitutional rights, including submission of several briefs at the United States Supreme Court and involvement with numerous precedent-setting cases. He is the past president and national chairman of the First Amendment Lawyers Association and founder of Florida Bar's First Amendment Law Committee. He was recently recognized as First Amendment Lawyer of the Year by global law experts. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
So you're one of the attorneys with the Woodhull Freedom Foundation versus the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about the lawsuit and why you guys started it?
Yes, absolutely. And I appreciate the opportunity to provide some information on what we're doing and what's happening in court and where the case is likely to go. First of all, I represent Woodhull and all the other plaintiffs in the lawsuit. We're now the appellants since we're at the appellate stage. And Woodhull, as you may know, is an organization that is devoted to sexual freedom, and they have close relationships with sex worker rights organizations, SWAP, and some others. And they've historically presented a summit in Washington, D.C., where they discuss issues such as harm reduction, keeping sex workers safe, out on the streets and online and so forth. And for years, we didn't have any concern about the nature of the summit and the promotion of the summit. But then, had the world changed in April of 2018 as FOSTA SESTA was passed. And, we started to look at, does this law affect us and our ability to continue promoting the summit and hosting the summit and talking about things like harm reduction and what happens if, a sex worker has to call the police and keeping people safe on the streets. And we started to think about it and look at the information that was going up on the site for the upcoming summit in 2018. We realized that this law puts an organization like Woodhull, square in its sights and could very well be applied to come after Woodhull and prosecute those who are promoting sex workers or or prostitution or facilitating in some way the actions of sex workers. And that hit everybody very hard at the time, and we realized we may need to take some things down from the website, not promote the summit the way that we have historically done it, out of concern that the information that we're promoting, the contact information for sex workers, their bios, the information itself, the substance of the information could be easily seen as facilitating or promoting prostitution.
If I understand you right, like that language that you're using, facilitating and promoting, that's the language of the FOSTA SESTA bill itself.
That's exactly right. One of the things that FOSTA SESTA did was to create a new federal crime, essentially using an online computer to promote or facilitate prostitution. And that's very broad and would include emails and Google documents and online invitations and the Woodhull website itself. All these things that Woodhull was doing to promote the summit and to promote its speakers at the summit could easily be fit within that concept of facilitating and promoting prostitution. And the reason that it's so difficult to evaluate that is that bill did not take the trouble to define promoting or facilitating,
right,
or prostitution for that matter.
Right.
So, it left everybody in a position of trying to guess at what Congress meant by this new law. There's obviously been no interpretation of it. There's been no cases brought yet other than ours. So at that time, the organization felt very concerned about its ability to continue doing business the way it had, and for a time censored some of the information on the site out of fear of potentially being prosecuted
Right.
or brought within the scope of this bill, and ultimately reversed course and decided, we're going to do it the way that we've always done it. We're going to file a lawsuit. We're going to challenge the law. We're going to get together with like-minded organizations and put together a constitutional challenge to this law that has done, so much damage not only to internet freedom but also to the safety and well-being of sex workers.
Can we back up for just a second? And for the people who are listening who are less familiar with FOSTA SESTA, can you just give a very brief overview?
So, this bill was a combination of both House and Senate bills that were, trying to do different things. The focus at the time was to address sex trafficking.
Right.
The bill was kind of sold to the lawmakers as an effort to try to eliminate sex trafficking online, really to go after Backpage and maybe other sites like it. Turned out it wasn't necessary to pass a law to go after Backpage because Backpage was taken down under existing law.
Right.
But the effort was supposedly to clamp down on sex trafficking and give survivors of sex trafficking the ability to sue websites that had facilitated or in some way benefited from sex trafficking. And as the bills made their way through Congress, committee got the bright idea that, why don't we just throw in consensual sex work within the scope of what we're trying to prohibit, because it's all really kind of the same as the lawmakers were thinking about it, without any input from the community that would be most impacted by the change in the law, i.e. sex workers,
Right.
And really without any request by anybody. The sex trafficking advocates weren't really even asking for this and for the law to be broadened to include consensual prostitution. But that's in fact what they did. There was an amendment to the bill. Things were flying pretty fast and loose at the time, and this was a juggernaut that was going to be passed in some form. This amendment just got added in to prohibit consensual sex work and the promotion of that online, and it gathered steam. The Department of Justice opposed it at the time, said you can't do this. It's gonna make things actually harder when we're trying to investigate trafficking and violations of federal law. The Department of Justice also complained about the fact that this is a retroactive law. The law is actually retroactive to cover events that occurred, activities that occurred before the law was even passed.
Right.
Any first-year law student would be able to tell you that you can't do that. That's a due process violation. The Department of Justice called out the Congress for trying to do it, and they were just ignored. The law passed and was signed into law and enacted in April of 2018. It did a few other things that, this is a bill that changed various portions of various laws. So we already talked about the fact that it now created this new federal law of using a computer to facilitate or promote prostitution, whatever any
Right.
of that means. It also took away a very important protection that Internet service providers had in the past, Section 230, which is it's been called the First Amendment of the Internet. And basically it allows online service providers like, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube to not be held responsible for the content of third-party posts
Right.
or videos or advertisements. If somebody's posting something online that's illegal, you can pursue them for doing that, but an online service provider that merely creates an intermediary or a venue for people to be able to post things online shouldn't be held responsible for legal violations or offenses by third parties.
Yeah.
That had been, the law of the Internet from really the beginning, and it was embodied in this statute called Section 230, which provides an immunity both from civil and criminal claims for anybody that would want to sue a company like YouTube for a third-party post or video.
And that protection had been in place since 96, right?
Yes. Congress realized right off the bat that in order for the Internet to function, that it would be essential for these online service providers to have that protection. Otherwise, there would not be any incentive to operate a site like a social media site, or Instagram or Twitter, and so forth, because it would be impossible to police all of the content flowing through the servers of a communication network like that. And if you did try to hold people responsible, these service providers responsible for third-party posts, they would have to be moderating in real time every word, every text, every video, every picture to try to determine whether it violated some law somewhere.
Right,
So-
millions and millions of people.
So the fact that FOSTA SESTA has rolled back those Section 230 protections, that's why we're seeing all these internet platforms getting spooked about sexual content now. We're seeing all these terms of service changes.
Right, exactly right. Now that the service providers are exposed to lawsuits and criminal actions at the state level as well as federal prosecution, they're, like you say, they're spooked. They don't know what to do. There's a lot of inconsistency in how they're responding to the law. Lawyers are just as confused as the operators because, like I said, none of these terms are defined. It's a brand new law. It's the first time they've ever attempted to impose liability on an online service provider for third-party content. It may very well not be constitutional on its own under the First Amendment, even irrespective of Section 230.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's what's happening now is there's a reaction to the removal of the immunity now that there is potential exposure for a operator of a website to be held responsible if a third party uses that website to promote or facilitate prostitution or sex trafficking. They've got to look at every picture, every post, every advertisement, every image, every comment, everything, because any of that may somehow promote or facilitate prostitution, especially when it comes to adult content. A lot of gray area there in terms of what might be promoting prostitution. Is all adult content potentially promoting prostitution? Some might say, and some of the opponents on the other side have said things like that.
Right.
So it's very difficult for the operators of these websites to know what content is promoting or facilitating prostitution.
These fears that we're talking about, these social media sites having, Woodhull itself, it has these same sort of concerns then about potentially getting accused of promoting and facilitating prostitution as a result of inviting sex workers to speak, having conversations about harm reduction efforts, and those sorts of things.
Exactly, and promoting all of that on the internet. FOSTA SESTA deals with online communications only, so it doesn't criminalize sex work, doesn't criminalize acts of promoting prostitution in the offline world, but it does apply to the online world.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so all of their communications, all of their their website content, all of their invitations, emails that went out, all of that could be potentially viewed as promoting or facilitating prostitution, since it deals with sex work and prostitution.
Right.
If you look at the definition that's typically used of the word facilitate, it means to make anything easier. Okay,
Yeah.
so if Woodhull is trying to help sex workers, trying to keep them safe, trying to educate them about their rights, are they making prostitution easier? Certainly the argument could be made, and some prosecutor could easily make that decision, and then all of a sudden Woodhull and others like it are exposed to very serious criminal prosecution with decades imprisonment in terms of penalties. And it's a similar situation to, I would say, like the groups that are trying to help drug addicts and like giving away sterile needles and so forth. And that was an argument that we made in the trial court, and said, those types of harm reduction groups could be alleged to be facilitating and promoting drug use and so forth. And the prosecutor said, oh, well, we would never do that. Well, as it turned out, shortly after that hearing, they are actually going after groups that distribute needles to heroin addicts and forth for exactly that kind of conduct. So, this is not a speculative fear. This is not something that, we're pulling out of thin air. This is a realistic concern for anybody that operates a website that deals with the concepts of prostitution, attempts to help in any way or support sex worker outreach programs. And, given the lack of definition and the vagueness of the law, this is something that has chilled, a tremendous amount of speech, as we've all seen. Lots of websites have gone dark. Many websites have moderated content, removed content, taken down profiles and users. And, at the end of the day, sex workers are paying a very heavy price as a result of losing their harm reduction tools, losing their access to information and communication, their inability to organize online and communicate online in the way that they had historically done to keep themselves safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the things that was happening online is that sex workers were sharing information about bad clients, about places where they could receive care, all sorts of things that made the lives of sex workers less dangerous and easier with this definition of facilitation.
Exactly right. As a result of all of those concerns, we put together a lawsuit. Others joined us, including archive.org and SWAP, and the Electronic Freedom Foundation came on, EFF came on, and assisted with some of the legal work. And we all put together this legal challenge and asked for the law to be stopped and what's called enjoined, which just means put a hold on it until there's a time for a trial. And the government took the position that there's no real harm here. Nobody would actually be prosecuted for this kind of thing. We wouldn't do that.
Why would they sign it into law if they don't intend to ever use it?
Well, they were claiming that we wouldn't use it against you. And the strategy there is to try to get rid of the lawsuit, try to deny what's called legal standing to the plaintiffs to be able to actually argue the constitutional issues. And that's what we were trying to do is get the court to address the First Amendment concerns, the due process concerns, and the constitutional violations that we think that this law imposes upon the internet and our clients. And that has never been addressed yet because, unfortunately, the court at the lower court level agreed with the government, and based on the government's representations that, they would never prosecute the plaintiffs for this kind of activity, they took the position that there needed to be some specific act of prostitution being facilitated or promoted, not just, sex work in general or harm reduction in general. And that the court seized upon that and found that there was a lack of standing by our plaintiffs. Now, one of the plaintiffs was a licensed massage therapist that lost his ability to continue advertising his massage services on Craigslist.
Right.
And that particular plaintiff did feel harm, did have, in our view, clear legal standing, wasn't a speculative potential harm. He was actually impacted, lost his forum for being able to advertise his business.
Right.
And the argument there was, well, even if we were to enjoin the law and stop the enforcement of FOSTA SESTA, you wouldn't necessarily get that forum back. And so it's not what's called redressable in the courts, and therefore, there's no guarantee that Craigslist would give you back the forum. Well, Craigslist did say we hope to bring it back, and we took it down because of FOSTA SESTA. So it's pretty clear that it is redressable. That the reason that people are losing their access to these forums and these communication devices is because of the law. And if it didn't exist, that presumably the internet would go back to normal. So, those are all the arguments that we're now arguing and raising on appeal. We have appealed the decision. We're asking for the appellate court to put a stop to FOSTA SESTA, to enjoin it, to find that we do have legal standing. And primarily the problem that we faced in the lower court is we believe the lower court did not get the actual legal test for standing in these First Amendment cases. Typically, yes, you do have to be actually impacted by a law in a very specific way in order to be able to challenge it. But in the First Amendment context, it's different. And this is true in a lot of things when it comes to the First Amendment. When you're dealing with First Amendment rights, the test is much broader because you're allowed to challenge laws even before they're enforced. It's called a pre-enforcement challenge, a very recognized type of challenge that you can bring. And the reason you're allowed to do it is because of the potential chilling effect on speech.
Right.
There's a lot of speech that isn't said. There's a lot of communication that doesn't occur as a result of the mere existence of the law. And so because of that chilling effect, because so many people are impacted by a law just by its mere existence, the legal test for standing is much broader and much easier to satisfy. And so that's now what we're arguing on the appeal, is that the correct test should be applied. We should be found to have standing because of the chilling effect. And once you find that, once we have legal standing, the rest of it is easy. I mean, this is a clear violation of the First Amendment. It's a clear violation of due process, and we should prevail on those issues.
So given all of that, when will the appellate court hear your case?
So the oral argument in the case is scheduled for September 20th at 9:30 in the D.C. Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C., and that is when the three-judge panel is going to hear the arguments. They already have all of the briefs. In other words, all the written arguments have been made and filed with the court. We have a long list of what are called amicus curiae, which are friends of the court, people who have supported our arguments, and they've submitted their own briefs as to why this law harms the internet, why we do have standing, why this is a tremendous First Amendment violation. So all of that is in the record, and the panel of judges will have read all of that, and this will be the opportunity for the judges to ask us questions, and we'll try to identify any concerns they have. Same thing with the government. The panel will ask the government attorneys questions, and sometime thereafter, we'll have a ruling.
Wow, that's really coming up soon.
Yeah. What do you anticipate is going to happen?
Yeah, as a lawyer doing this for 30 years now, it's impossible to predict any decision by a court. We're talking about human beings. It's not a computer program that you feed in and you get a result. These are people making decisions. This is a brand new law. It hasn't been interpreted before. Mm-hmm. I think it's a critically important case. I think the court will take it seriously. This is a court that is used to dealing with constitutional challenges to congressional laws, to U.S. laws, and they typically go here. So believe that, especially given the number of briefs that have been filed in support of our position, mm-hmm. and there have been some filed in support of the government's position. There's been a bunch of states that have lined up and said, this is a really important law, and we want to enforce it aggressively right away. And we looked at that and said, well, thank you. You've now made our argument. That's exactly what we're saying. All those states out there want to go out and enforce the law. And that's a really important point because, the Department of Justice might say, we don't intend to enforce this law, and we wouldn't prosecute Woodhull for facilitating or promoting prostitution. That doesn't stop anybody else from doing it.
Right.
This Section 230 now opens up all of the other states to be able to enforce the law against our client or anybody else. It allows civil lawsuits to be filed. So it really doesn't matter what the Department of Justice would do or wouldn't do. It's the law itself that has opened up this opportunity for anybody really to try to make a claim that any website facilitates or promotes prostitution if it deals with these sexually oriented issues.
Isn't that pretty tricky when you're talking about the internet and you start talking about different states and how they would interpret this? I mean, the internet is not located to any particular place. I mean, transactions take place across state lines.
Yeah, and that's kind of our point, that any particular state's attorney or law enforcement official could interpret the law differently than the Department of Justice. Mm-hmm. They could interpret it very broadly. There might be political motives to go after a particular site and interpret the law very broadly to shut down online communications on a particular site. It doesn't matter, again, what the Department of Justice thinks the law means or how they would interpret it or what they would do or wouldn't do. It matters what the law says, how broad it is, how undefined it is, and the fact that it now gives the authority to all these different enforcement agencies to pursue website operators.
Right. Yeah, so in terms of finding plaintiffs for this case, was this something that was difficult to do? Did people feel reticent to expose themselves?
That's an excellent question, and it's obviously the companies or the websites that would have the best standing arguments, the clear standing arguments, are concerned about approaching a court and saying, I'm promoting and facilitating prostitution, or I'm involved in sex trafficking, and so therefore I'll probably be prosecuted, and I would like to challenge this law.
Right.
So you don't find too many of those people coming out of the woodwork and deciding to participate in a legal challenge. But it's important to identify that this law goes so much further than only affecting people who are engaged in illegal activity. Mm-hmm. It affects people who have communications on their website that are what we call adjacent to prostitution and sex work, or content that might be somehow associated with those concepts, even if the website operator is not themselves promoting or facilitating prostitution. The communications could be interpreted in that way. There's been all kinds of debate over, what content promotes and facilitates prostitution and sex work, and in the cases that have been brought against website operators like Backpage and others. There's a lot of room for debate there. And, so that there have been cases involving ads for BDSM providers or companionship or sugar daddies or telephone sex or cam girls. So not everybody sees these things the same way. And the website operator is in a very difficult position to try to interrogate, the users or try to determine the intent behind a lot of the content that appears online. So what inevitably happens is there is a broad censorship imposed on content that might be risky, but would otherwise be protected by the First Amendment. So if you have, an ad or a picture or a video or something out there that in some way somebody might think could promote or facilitate prostitution, it's likely going to be gone, even if it would be otherwise protected by the First Amendment, because of this new fear of, spending decades in jail if you get it wrong.
Right. This may be a little far afield, but I know that there was just an article that came out that was talking about how there's evidence now that Backpage was cooperating with efforts to shut down traffickers. Do you think that this would be useful at all in fighting against FOSTA SESTA, to say actually these websites help to not only make it easier for the DOJ, but to keep sex workers safe as time has passed now and Backpage has been shut down?
Well, that's actually an argument that we already made, and we have evidence to support that by our experts and people who've submitted affidavits in support of our request for an injunction. It's clear that removing the websites from the mix and shutting down these sites eliminates a treasure trove of information that would otherwise be available for law enforcement. People that are investigating actual trafficking want these websites to exist and to continue cooperating. As we've now found out, the whole Backpage narrative was a house of cards, and in fact, they were cooperating, and it looks like from what was released, potentially set up as a violator when, in fact, they were attempting everything they could to stay in compliance with the law and to cooperate with law enforcement. But at the end of the day, this new law that was, again, designed to take down Backpage but wasn't needed, now eliminates essentially the access by law enforcement to the very information that would help take down trafficking. What you've done by this law is now either shut the sites down so there is no digital footprint anymore, or you've pushed them all overseas where they have very little incentive and no legal obligation to cooperate with U.S. law enforcement.
Right.
So, the net effect is now to enable trafficking, to make sex work more dangerous, and to harm the very victims that the law was trying to help.
Right, to push it outside, either outside of U.S. jurisdiction or outside of law enforcement's sort of visibility altogether.
Exactly right, and to push sex workers who are using these websites to control their own destinies, to operate their own businesses, and to engage directly with customers, to push them into the hands of dangerous people and to force them into much more dangerous relationships instead of relying on websites to screen customers.
Yeah, because that's the thing. Sex workers can operate much more independently if they have platforms where they can work.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, it's been a net loss for everybody that the law purportedly tried to help. It's been a devastating failure when it comes to online freedom, online innovation. The next Instagram or Twitter or next platform is not going to launch because now they have these risks of being prosecuted, and they have all these moderation obligations that weren't there before. So we're going to see, fewer and fewer new platforms. The next Uber might not ever happen as a result of this now incredible liability that they have to face in launching any platform that allows user content.
So if I understand you correctly, the FOSTA SESTA bill prohibits the facilitation and promotion of prostitution, but at the same time fails to define what prostitution is. So does that mean that all these websites have to kind of guess how the federal government is defining prostitution?
That's exactly right. This law does not define, promote, or facilitate or prostitution. And so what that does is force the website operator to try to figure out how either the federal government or some state law enforcement officer or even some civil plaintiff would interpret those terms. There's not a definition that we can rely on. There's no case history that we can look to see how the law was interpreted in other instances. There is no federal crime of prostitution, so there's no other statute you can look to in the federal system to see, what the government thinks prostitution means. And in fact, the activity is defined differently in different states. Some states require certain activities to occur for the prostitution statutes to kick in. Others are broader. Some require that the person paying the money receive the sexual gratification. Others don't. So there's a lot of different elements that are interpreted different ways and stated different ways in different jurisdictions. So yeah, it's very difficult for a website operator to try to identify, okay, which definition of prostitution are we dealing with? Where are the people involved? Which state has jurisdiction? Who's going to interpret it? All these unknowns, which again contributes to this climate of censorship and the chilling effect on protected speech.
Yeah, that's all really interesting. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you think that the sex work community in particular should know about this case or should be paying attention to?
Well, a couple of observations on that. Number one, the one benefit of the passage of this law is the mobilization of the sex worker community. I really think that they have found their voice as a result of this law that has now impacted them very directly. And they're speaking out, they're organizing, they're identifying the problem, and so that this is a positive, and so it's helpful. Obviously, it would have been tremendously helpful to have that kind of organization and voice before the law was passed. And
right.
As some of us were shouting from the mountaintops, look out, this thing is coming, it's going to be bad. I don't know if there's anything anybody could have done to stop it, the way that it had kind of matured. But I think it's really important for sex workers and for the community to watch out for the next problem, because this certainly isn't going to be the end of the government's attempt to conflate concepts of trafficking with consensual sex work. It's not going to be the end of the attempts to try to regulate and scare service providers and banks and other institutions into not doing any business with anybody that's allegedly involved in prostitution or sex work or whatever else they define to be within the realm of prohibited activity. So this is good in a way that it's kind of caught the attention of the community, and they can now communicate with each other and identify the next problem. So I think that's important.
Yeah.
This is a case that is tremendously important. There's no other challenge out there that will resolve these issues. There have been no prosecutions under the law yet, and so no one has had an opportunity to raise any constitutional challenges other than us. And the law, frankly, is not likely to be repealed at this point. It's very difficult to repeal a federal criminal statute, and particularly one that has recently been passed.
Right.
So, the chips are all on the table in this lawsuit. Woodhull has been carrying the brunt of it for the last year and a half. They've been doing a great job and continuing to push the case, and the lawyers have donated a lot of time. Obviously, any support that the community or anybody else listening to this broadcast would want to provide is welcome. This work is tremendously burdensome and can be quite expensive. So it's always good to have the support. It's good to have the moral support and the financial support of the community. And Woodhull is committed to pursuing it along with the other plaintiffs. And this is a case that could very well reach the Supreme Court. I mean, it involves a federal statute. And if we win, and we hope we do, you can be virtually guaranteed that the government is going to appeal that to the U.S. Supreme Court. If we lose, I would imagine that we would want to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court as well. So,
so either way.
Yeah. And, look, a lot can happen. I mean, the court could find that we have standing and, send the case back down to the trial court to deal with the constitutional issues. The court could just send the whole thing back down because the judge made a mistake on some matter of interpretation. So it could go up and down a little bit, and that's, what has historically happened in these constitutional challenges. But the most important thing is to put a stop to it as soon as possible, because we're seeing so much damage be done in the interim, and so much speech being eliminated from the internet, and the danger to the sex worker community being exacerbated. So we're shooting for an immediate stop to the law and hoping that that's the result, but we're committed to the long haul.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing on this.
Yeah, and also for enlightening us and our listeners as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear how the process works of a constitutional lawsuit like this.
Well, yeah, it's an important case. It's one of those, in a lawyer's career where, they feel that, society will benefit from a win, not just the clients. And, we see so many other people, other clients of our law firm and others just who have reported things to us where they're just directly impacted by this law. And so we're hoping that the courts rule the right way, and we will see what happens. But appreciate all the support of you and your listeners.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if people want to find more information about this upcoming trial, where would they find that?
So the Woodhull website contains a page that will give you all the information about the lawsuit. And so if you go to woodhullfoundation.org, there's a tab there that will provide all the information about the lawsuit, including all the briefs and all the rulings and anything you want to know. As far as my law firm, it's Walters Law Group. We're on Twitter at Walters Law Group, and firstamendment.com is our website. So we'd be happy to have any comments, and if you're interested in anything we do, feel free to contact us. We'd be happy to help.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you for joining us for yet another episode of the Peep Show podcast. I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at PeachSage.
And I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at sapiotextual or at jessiesage.com.
We would like to remind you that we have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Our music is courtesy of Joe Kennedy. The show was produced by Jessie and PJ Sage.
Signing off. Have a great week.